Greetings, dear listeners of this channel. I am immensely grateful to you for choosing me. Please forgive my mistakes. I truly do my best and appreciate your feedback. Please stay tuned to this channel and enjoy your time in a world where the mind is free. I realized I'd been put in charge of a suicide mission the moment I saw the faces of the officers in the briefing room. They looked at me as if I were already dead, just not aware of it yet. A holographic projection hovered over the table. Red enemy markers filled the entire sector like a swarm of burning wasps, while our blue indicators looked like pathetic crumbs against that nightmare. 200 ships. All I had left were 200 damn ships after the slaughter at Sirius, where we lost 3/4 of the fleet in 8 hours of non-stop fighting. And facing us, 3,000 coalition units, fresh, angry, and eager to finish what they had started. General Weiss was reading command's orders in a monotone, but all I heard were the numbers. 8 billion refugees, 17 days to evacuate, the Eagle Gate system, the last line before the inner worlds. If we failed to hold this system, humanity would lose 8 billion lives and its last hope of surviving this war. I looked at my officers and saw the same thing I'd been seeing in the mirror every morning for the past 3 months. Fatigue burned down to the bone. Captain Torres was clenching his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Commander Zhao stared at the hologram with an empty look, as if already counting how many hours we had left to live. They understood the math of this situation better than I cared to admit. 200 against 3,000. This wasn't a battle, not even a slaughter. It was just a slow erasure of our names from the rolls of the living. But Weiss kept talking about strategic importance, about duty, about giving the transports time to escape into hyperspace. 17 days. I had to hold for 17 days against an armada that could grind us into dust in 17 hours if it wanted to. I felt a cold anger rising inside, not at the enemy, not at command, but at the universe itself for putting me in this impossible position. When the meeting ended, I was left alone in the vast room with the glowing hologram of the Eagle Gate system. I rotated the image, studying every asteroid, every gravitational field, every damn cloud of cosmic dust that might give us the slightest advantage. The enemy outnumbered us 15-1, but I had something they didn't. I knew this system like the back of my hand. I'd run training exercises here 3 years ago, back when I still believed the war would never reach the inner sectors. The gas giant on orbit 4 with its monstrous gravity well, the comet cloud on the system's edge, 2 asteroid belts with millions of potential projectiles. All of it could become a weapon if used correctly. A plan started forming in my mind, a crazy, desperate plan that required a surgeon's precision and a gambler's luck. I had to turn the entire system into one giant trap, using every rock, every gravitational distortion, every millimeter of space as a battlefield. I called all ship commanders for an emergency briefing in an hour and began putting together the presentation. I needed to convince them we could do this, that we had a chance, even though I wasn't sure myself. But when I looked at the hologram of the transport ships already loading refugees on the 3rd planet, when I thought of the 8 billion people who believed the fleet would protect them, I understood I had no right to doubt. Torres walked into the room with 2 cups of synthetic coffee, set one in front of me, and said the crews were ready to follow orders, even if those orders meant certain death. I nodded, took a sip of the awful drink, and started marking positions for the first engagement on the hologram. The enemy would come through Jump Point Alpha, that was obvious from their trajectory, and I intended to greet them with such hell they'd regret ever crossing humanity. I had 17 days, 200 ships, and a plan that sounded insane even to me. But it was all we had, and it would have to be enough. They emerged from hyperspace at exactly Oro 6:14 ship time, and I watched it from the flagship's bridge, feeling my heartbeat somewhere up in my throat. First came the spatial distortions, the familiar folds in reality that precede a jump, and then, as if tearing through the fabric of the universe, Coalition ships began to materialize. Hundreds of them. Damn hundreds, one after another, their silhouettes flashing onto the tactical displays as red markers. The vanguard, about 800 units if my calculations were right. Cruisers, destroyers, a few light battleships at the front. They appeared right at Point Alpha, exactly where I expected them to, because it was the shortest route toward the inner planets. The tactical officer reported the enemy fleet's arrival was complete, and I issued the order I'd rehearsed in my head all night. Activate the minefield in Sector 773. My hands were perfectly steady as I pressed the commands on the panel, even though inside everything tightened in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The enemy advanced with confidence, their formation perfectly aligned, a classic attack posture taught in any military academy. They were heading straight toward the gas giant, unaware that I'd spent the last 48 hours turning its gravity well into a massive trap. 3,000 automated mines, each the size of a small fighter, drifted in precisely calculated positions, disguised as space debris and asteroid dust. When the vanguard entered the kill zone, I gave the detonation command, and the region lit up. I watched it on the screens, a chain reaction of explosions tearing their front lines apart, plasma bursts lighting the void like thousands of tiny suns. Their cruisers broke apart, destroyers tumbled lifelessly, and the gas giant's gravity pulled the wreckage down into its relentless funnel. In the first 20 minutes, we destroyed more enemy ships than we had during the entire battle at Sirius, and I could hardly believe the plan worked exactly as I intended. Chaos in their ranks was total. Our sensors showed their command network had collapsed and their ships scattered in panic, trying to escape the kill zone, but gravity held them tight. I ordered the 2nd and 3rd squadrons to move into strike positions and finish off what was left of the vanguard. Our ships launched out from behind the asteroid belt, where they'd been hiding for the past 12 hours, and unleashed a volley of torpedoes on the disorganized enemy. It looked like a hunt. We were the wolves, and they were a confused herd that had no idea where death came from. Torpedoes found their marks one after another. I heard captains reporting over the command channel. Target destroyed, target destroyed, target destroyed. In 2 hours of fighting, we erased nearly 300 of their ships while losing only 7 of our own, and I understood this was a victory, a real, unbelievable victory I hadn't dared to imagine. But I also knew this was only the beginning. The enemy now understood who they were dealing with, and next time they would come prepared. The coalition began retreating around 0830. The remnants turned and moved toward the system's outer boundary beyond the reach of our minefield. I watched their withdrawal on the tactical display, feeling a strange mix of triumph and dread. We'd hit them hard, shocked them with audacity and tactics, forced them to retreat and rethink their approach. That bought us time, precious time for the refugee evacuation. But I also saw their main forces starting to assemble at the jump point, forming new battle groups, more cautious, more lethal. Zhao reported that the transport ships had finished loading the first wave of refugees and were ready for departure, meaning we had bought them at least a day. I ordered all ships to fall back to the inner defensive line and begin repairs. We had maybe 12 hours before their next assault. I rose from the command chair, walked to the viewport, and looked at the scatter of wreckage drifting in the void. Remains of 300 enemy ships, our first victory in this insane war of attrition. But I knew there were still 16 days ahead of us, and each one would only be harder. After the first victory, I knew I'd never be able to pull off a trick like that again. The enemy was shocked, but not stupid, and they quickly adapted to our tactics. On the second day, they entered the system in a completely different way, spread out, with reconnaissance drones out front, scanning every meter of space for traps. I watched their cautious advance from the bridge and understood that now we had to play a different game, a game of hide and seek across the void. I divided the fleet into 12 strike groups, 15 to 20 ships each, and sent them into the comet cloud on the system's edge, where sensors worked poorly due to radiation interference and dense ice debris. The plan was simple to the point of insanity. Hit from the dark, disappear, reposition, strike again, never let the enemy pin us down in a straight fight. It was guerrilla warfare on a cosmic scale, and I prayed my captains would be clever and fast enough to survive in this hell. The second strike group, commanded by Captain Ramirez, was the first to engage at the end of the second day. They burst out of the comet dust cloud, fired a volley at an enemy destroyer, and vanished back into the darkness in seconds. The enemy tried to chase them, but inside the cloud, our ships had the advantage. We knew every sector, every trajectory. We had trained here for months before the war. The fifth group attacked 3 hours later, the seventh 2 hours after that. And it went on endlessly, day and night, without pause. I sat on the bridge coordinating the attacks, watching the tactical display as enemy red markers darted around chaotically, trying to find us, while we were ghosts, shadows appearing only long enough to kill before dissolving again. By the end of the third day, the enemy had lost another 80 ships, but I saw the toll it was taking. My captains reported damage, crew exhaustion, guidance systems failing under constant stress. We were buying time, but paying for it with our nerves and our resources. At night, when the intensity of combat briefly dropped, our engineers performed miracles. They repaired breached hulls in open space, replaced burnt-out reactors, patched life support systems with tape and prayers. I went down into the engineering bays and saw people who hadn't slept for 30 hours straight, working in suits among sparks and smoke, practically holding the fleet together through sheer will to live. The flagship's chief engineer, old grumbler Mackenzie, told me once that they slept 2 hours a day at best, and even then in short bursts, because ships came back from engagements so torn apart they had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. I saw a young technician who'd fallen asleep right on the hangar floor with a wrench in his hand, saw a girl from the repair crew crying from exhaustion but still welding a breach in a fighter's hull. They were heroes, no less than the pilots going into battle, and I understood that without them we wouldn't have lasted even 3 days. On the fourth day, we suffered our first serious losses. The 9th Strike Group walked into an ambush when the enemy predicted our maneuver and positioned a net of heavy cruisers in the sector where we normally retreated after an attack. They lost all 15 ships in 20 minutes. I heard the last transmission from their commander, Captain Chen, shouting for his people to abandon ship as plasma volleys tore his flagship apart. By the end of the fourth day, we had lost 15 ships and more than 200 crew members, and these were the first names on the list I knew would grow with every passing day. I stood on the bridge watching transport ships jump into hyperspace one by one with another wave of refugees, 4 days behind us, 13 still ahead. The enemy was getting angrier, more cautious, more lethal with every hour. They learned from their mistakes, adapted to our tactics, and I understood the game of hide-and-seek would soon be over, and we'd have to find new ways to survive this hell. By the 5th day, I understood the enemy had begun to see our weakness. They noticed how we avoided direct engagements, how we retreated more often, how our strikes were becoming less destructive simply because we were running out of ammunition and strength. I needed to deliver another serious blow, something bold and unexpected enough to make them question their numerical advantage again. I studied the system map all night, and my eyes kept returning to the narrow sector between the inner and outer asteroid belts, a region pilots called the dead zone, because gravitational anomalies made navigation hellishly difficult, and sensors barely worked due to interference. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, if I could lure a large enough enemy formation inside. The plan formed slowly, detail by detail, and by morning, I knew exactly what I intended to do: simulate a retreat so convincingly that the enemy would believe they had finally cornered us. I took personal command of the first squadron, 35 ships including the flagship, and moved them into an open position near the inner asteroid belt, deliberately exposed, deliberately careless. The enemy reacted exactly the way I hoped. Their scouts detected us within 2 hours, and they sent a sizable force, about 150 ships, to finally pin down and destroy at least part of our elusive fleet. I watched them on the displays as they closed in, their formation aggressive and confident. They thought they had prey trapped. When the distance dropped to critical, I gave the order to retreat, and we began falling back into the dead zone, pretending to panic, pretending our navigation systems were failing, pretending we were losing formation. The enemy accelerated, sensing an easy victory, and followed us straight into the trap I'd been preparing for the last 18 hours. I gripped the armrest so hard my fingers went white as I watched the red markers enter the kill zone. When their entire vanguard was inside the dead zone, squeezed between the two asteroid belts, I gave the attack order, and the region erupted from 3 directions at once. The 4th, 7th, and 10th strike groups, which had been hiding among the asteroids for the last day, burst out of cover and unleashed everything they had: torpedoes, rail slugs, plasma charges. We hit them from 3 angles. They panicked, slammed into asteroids, collided with each other, their command network collapsing under the assault. I swung the flagship around and led my squadron back into the fight, finishing them off methodically, ship by ship, turning their cruisers into twisted scrap. In 40 minutes, we destroyed 70 of their ships, an outright slaughter, a real cosmic butchery, and I felt a grim satisfaction watching their destroyers burn. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Their remnants weren't retreating in panic. They were withdrawing in an organized fashion, collecting data, scanning our ships, counting them. The enemy pulled back about an hour after the battle began, having lost more than 80 ships. But I realized we'd made a mistake. We had shown them too much. For the first time in 5 days, we had gathered a significant portion of the fleet in one place, and their sensors managed to capture our true strength, count our ships, assess the condition of our systems. I saw the recordings of their scans and intercepted transmissions. They now knew we had fewer than 200 ships left, that our reactors were pushed to their limits, that our armor was covered with temporary patches, that we were holding together only through willpower and desperation. Zhao reported that evening that the enemy had begun changing tactics. They no longer chased every one of our groups. They started planning something larger, pulling their main forces together. I stood by the viewport, looking at the drifting wreckage of enemy ships in the dead zone, and understood that we had won the battle but possibly lost the war. Now they knew we were nearing exhaustion, and their next strike would be aimed at crushing us with a single, massive assault. 12 days remained until the evacuation was complete, and I didn't know if we had enough strength left to survive that long. On the 6th day, everything changed. The enemy stopped playing our game and began a war of attrition we couldn't possibly win by definition. They attacked from 5 directions at once, in small groups of 30 to 40 ships, but constantly, without pause, around the clock. I had to divide the fleet into 8 operational groups and scatter them across the entire system to cover critical points, transport hubs, retreat routes, evacuation zones. I understood this was exactly what they wanted: to spread our forces thin, prevent us from concentrating for a strong counterstrike, and slowly grind us down in endless small skirmishes. Every 2 or 3 hours, new reports came in about enemy contact, and I jumped between sectors on the tactical display, trying to decide where to send reserves, who could be left alone to face the enemy, and who needed immediate support. By the end of the 6th day, I'd lost another 20 ships, and more importantly, I'd lost the initiative. Now we only reacted to their moves, only defended, only tried to plug the endless holes in our broken defense line. The next 3 days blended into one endless nightmare without sleep, without rest, without a single second to breathe. I didn't leave the flagship's bridge at all, slept in 20 or 30-minute bursts right in the command chair, woke up to urgent reports, made a decision, then slipped back into something resembling sleep. Stimulants became routine for everyone. Medics handed them out by the handful, because without chemical support, crews simply couldn't function at this level of intensity. I saw people working with glassy eyes, their hands shaking over the consoles, falling asleep, standing up and waking a second later when the ship shuddered from a hit. Torres brought me another dose of stimulants once and said that if I kept going like this, I'd drop dead right there on the bridge, but I had no choice. Every decision had to be made personally, every maneuver coordinated, every loss recorded. By the 8th day, I no longer remembered the last time I'd eaten real food, drunk anything besides coffee, or seen anything other than tactical screens. Losses grew at a terrifying pace. Each day we lost 15 to 20 ships, sometimes more, and by the end of the 9th day, I had only 140 combat units left from the original 200. That meant that in 9 days, we'd lost nearly a third of the fleet, and if the pace didn't change, by day 17, I'd have nothing left at all. I looked at the list of destroyed ships every night, names, dates, circumstances of death, all entered into a database I promised myself to preserve at any cost, so people would remember who gave their lives for their rescue. Captain Rodriguez on the cruiser Invincible, Lieutenant Yamamoto on the destroyer Sharp Blade, Commander Peterson on the battleship Unbroken. All of them had become lines in my list of the dead, all burned in the void protecting refugee transports. I felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier each day, each loss leaving a scar on my conscience. But I couldn't stop to grieve. I still had living people who needed me to lead them through this hell. On the 9th day, I realized I was on the brink of complete physical and mental collapse. I started seeing hallucinations in the corners of my vision, forgetting simple things, mixing up officers' names. Zhao found me one night standing in front of the tactical display, just staring into nothing. I didn't even notice her enter the bridge. She forced me to lie down in the med bay for 4 hours of mandatory sleep under sedatives, and when I woke up, I discovered she had coordinated the defense in my absence without losing a single ship. Maybe I should have delegated more responsibilities earlier, but my habit of controlling everything personally was stronger than common sense. The doctor told me that if I didn't start sleeping at least 3 hours a day, my heart would simply stop, and then the fleet wouldn't have a commander at all. I promised him I'd try, though we both knew it was a lie. 8 days remained until the evacuation was complete, 140 ships against nearly 2,500, and I stared at the numbers on the screen, trying to understand how the hell we were supposed to last 8 more days when even now we were held together only by stimulants, desperation, and sheer stubbornness. The 10th day began with a catastrophe. The enemy broke through our defenses in Sector 12 and reached the inner planets, where the last industrial sites of the system and the evacuation transport hubs were located. I woke to the blare of the general alarm and saw on the tactical screen a picture that made my heart stop. A large enemy formation, more than 300 ships, moving toward 2 targets at once. One group headed for the orbital shipyards above the 4th planet, where we repaired damaged ships and kept the last reserves of ammunition and spare parts. The second group was moving toward the 3rd planet, where a column of 40 transport ships carrying 2 million refugees was still loading. I had only 70 ships in reserve, and they were positioned roughly equal distance from both targets. I could protect one, but not both. Torres stood beside me in silence, waiting for my decision, and I understood that the next 30 seconds would determine the outcome of the entire operation and the fate of millions. I stared at the screen, running the options with the mechanical precision only stimulants could provide. If I protected the shipyards, we would preserve our ability to repair and resupply, which theoretically could allow the fleet to survive the remaining 7 days. But 2 million refugees would die, 40 transports would be destroyed, and the entire war would lose meaning because we weren't fighting for ships or shipyards. We were fighting for people. If I protected the transports, the shipyards would be lost. We'd lose any capacity for proper repairs. Ammunition would have to be rationed even more severely, and the fleet would slowly fall apart without support. But 2 million lives would be saved, 40 transports would escape, and we would at least accomplish part of our mission. I closed my eyes for a second, saw the faces of children in the transport bays, heard in memory the voices of women and elders praying for rescue, and realized there was no real choice. I opened my eyes and gave the order: all reserves to the 3rd planet, protect the transports at any cost, leave the shipyards to fend for themselves. My ships reached the 3rd planet 20 minutes ahead of the enemy, and we formed a defensive line between them and the unarmed transports. The battle was brutal and desperate. We knew there was no room to fall back, that every enemy ship breaking through our line meant thousands of dead civilians. I personally commanded the flagship at the center of the fight, and we held like the damned, losing ship after ship, but not letting the enemy through. After 40 minutes, Zhao reported that the last transport had completed emergency loading and was ready to jump, and I ordered the entire column to enter hyperspace immediately. I watched on the displays as 40 massive transports vanished one by one into rifts in space-time, carrying 2 million lives to safety. And at that moment, a message came from the shipyards. They were under attack, no defenses, evacuation underway. I could do nothing but listen to the panicked transmissions as the enemy methodically destroyed the docks, warehouses, repair stations, all the infrastructure that had kept the fleet alive for the past 10 days. By evening, the shipyards had become a cloud of debris in orbit around the fourth planet, and I gathered the senior officers on the flagship. Their faces said everything. They understood what the loss of the shipyards meant. They knew that now every piece of damage would be permanent, every spent round irreplaceable, every breach a fatal wound. Torres directly asked how long I thought we could last without a repair base, and I answered honestly, maybe 3 days, 4 at most, before the fleet simply fell apart from accumulated damage. Zhao suggested retreating to the outer systems to save what remained of the fleet, but I refused. We had orders to hold the system for 17 days, and there were still 7 days of evacuation left. I saw in their eyes the understanding that I had just signed our death warrant by choosing the transports over the shipyards, but no one said it aloud. We just silently returned to our posts, knowing that the final week of this nightmare lay ahead. And now we had no margin for error, no buffer, nothing but failing ships and the determination to finish the mission. I stayed alone on the bridge, staring at the place where the shipyards had once been, and for the first time in 10 days, allowed myself to think that maybe we wouldn't live to see the 17th day. The 10th day began with a catastrophe. The enemy broke through our defenses in Sector 12 and reached the inner planets, where the last industrial facilities of the system and the evacuation transport hubs were located. I woke to the blare of the general alarm and saw on the tactical screen a picture that made my heart stop. A large enemy formation, more than 300 ships, moving toward 2 targets at once, and I understood this wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated strategy designed to force me into an impossible choice. One group headed for the orbital shipyards above the fourth planet, where we repaired damaged ships and kept the last reserves of ammunition and spare parts. Without them, the fleet would fall apart within days. The second group was heading for the third planet, where a column of 40 transport ships carrying 2 million refugees was still loading, defenseless civilian vessels that wouldn't survive a minute under enemy fire. I had only 70 ships in reserve, positioned roughly equal distance from both targets. I could protect one, but not both, and the enemy knew that perfectly, which was why they struck exactly this way. I stood before the tactical display running the options with the mechanical precision the stimulants allowed, but behind every option, I saw the faces of the people I was condemning to die. If I protected the shipyards, we would preserve our ability to repair and resupply, theoretically allowing the fleet to survive the remaining 7 days and ultimately save more refugees in the long run. That was the cold military logic they teach in the academy. But 2 million people would die right now. 40 transports would be destroyed in minutes, and I would know I could have saved them, but chose metal over lives. If I protected the transports, the shipyards would be destroyed. We'd lose the ability to repair, ammunition would have to be rationed even more brutally, and the fleet would slowly fall apart without support. Every officer on the bridge understood this was essentially suicide, that we were signing the death sentence for what remained of the fleet. Torres stood beside me in silence, waiting for my decision, and in his eyes I saw the understanding that no choice would be the right one, that the enemy had forced us into a situation where winning was impossible, only choosing how we would lose. I closed my eyes for a second and saw the faces of children in the transport bays, heard the voices of women and elderly people praying for rescue, remembered why we were here in the first place. not to save ships and shipyards, but to save people, every last person we could. Military logic said one thing, but I wasn't just a soldier. I was a human being who had sworn to protect civilians, and that oath weighed more than any tactical calculation. I opened my eyes and gave the order, all reserves to the third planet, protect the transports at any cost, leave the shipyards to their fate, let them do what they can. Torres gave me a long look in which I saw understanding, respect, and fear of what awaited us next, then simply nodded and began relaying the orders to the squadron commanders. I heard their voices over the command channel. No one objected. No one asked for explanations. They all understood I had just chosen people over steel, lives over logic, and that this decision would likely kill all of us long before the 17th day. My ships reached the third planet 20 minutes ahead of the enemy, and we formed a defensive line between them and the defenseless transports, knowing there was nowhere to fall back to, that every enemy ship breaking through our line meant thousands of dead civilians. The battle was brutal and desperate. We held like the damned, losing ship after ship, but not letting the enemy get a meter closer to the transports. I personally commanded the flagship at the center of the fight, and we burned but held, bleeding plasma from ruptures but still firing, losing entire sections but not retreating an inch. After 40 minutes of combat, Zhao reported that the last transport had completed emergency loading and was ready to jump, and I ordered the entire column to enter hyperspace immediately without waiting for standard checks. I watched on the displays as 40 massive transports vanished one after another into rifts in space-time, carrying 2 million lives to safety. And at that moment, a message came from the shipyards. They were under attack, no defenses left, evacuation underway, but with almost no chance of escaping. I listened to the panicked transmissions from engineers and technicians screaming for help, watched on the screen as the enemy methodically destroyed docks, storage bays, repair stations, every piece of infrastructure that had kept the fleet combat ready for the past 10 days, and I could do nothing, only stand and watch as our last hope for survival went up in flames. I realized we had crossed the line where the rules of war end and pure madness begins when Captain Morrison suggested ramming an enemy dreadnought with his half-destroyed frigate. We were at an emergency meeting on the 11th day. I had 80 ships left out of 200. Ammunition was running out at a terrifying pace, and the enemy kept pressing us from every direction, not giving us a single second to breathe. Morrison stood by the holographic map with the face of a man already dead inside, calmly explaining that his ship wouldn't survive until the end of the evacuation anyway. The reactor was cracking, life support systems were running at 20%, and the armor was holding together only by the crew's prayers. He proposed using his frigate as a guided missile, accelerating to maximum speed and slamming straight into the bridge of the enemy flagship coordinating the attacks in our sector. I looked at him and understood it wasn't heroism or desperation. It was cold calculation from a man who decided his death should be worth more than another line on the casualty list. The other captains were silent, and in that silence I heard agreement. We all understood we had reached the point where conventional tactics no longer worked, where we had to invent new ways to kill the enemy with whatever we had left. The next 2 days turned into a surreal nightmare in which I issued orders that under normal circumstances would have been considered madness or war crimes against our own people. Morrison carried out his plan at the end of the 11th day. I watched on the screen as his frigate, running on its dying reactor, reached impossible speed and rammed the bridge of the enemy dreadnought, tearing it in half in a blinding burst of plasma and metal. 73 members of his crew became a weapon, and their sacrifice cost the enemy a flagship and 6 hours of total disorganization across the sector. After that, other captains began bringing similar proposals. Some wanted to use debris from destroyed ships as giant projectiles, pushing them into enemy formations with tractor beams. Others suggested overloading their reactors and detonating them in the middle of enemy groups, turning our ships into makeshift thermonuclear bombs. I approved every plan, knowing I was signing death sentences for hundreds of people, but the alternative was one: surrender. and let the enemy slaughter the refugee transports. By the end of the 12th day, we had lost another 20 ships, but each loss took dozens of enemy units with it. We were trading lives at a rate of 1 to 10, and that was a deal I was willing to make again and again. On the 13th day, I went down to the flagship hangar and saw a scene that burned itself into my memory. A young lieutenant, no older than 25, manually programming the navigation computer of a fighter for a collision course with an enemy cruiser. His hands trembled as he entered the coordinates, and on the helmet display I saw a photo of a girl, his fiancée or his sister, someone he was dying for. He noticed me, straightened, saluted with parade ground precision as if we were at a ceremony instead of the eve of his death, and said his ship wouldn't last until the end of the week anyway, so at least his death should be useful. I wanted to say something, offer gratitude or comfort, but the words caught in my throat, and I simply nodded, giving one last gesture of respect to a man who would cease to exist in an hour. There were dozens like him. Pilots of shattered fighters, crews of dying frigates, engineers on ships with ruptured reactors, all lining up for their turn with death, turning themselves into weapons of last resort. By the end of the 13th day, I had only 59 operational ships remaining, but the enemy had lost more than 400 units in 3 days, and in their transmissions, I heard a note of fear. They were starting to fear us, these lunatics who went to their deaths smiling. Late on the 13th day, I sat on the bridge reviewing the updated casualty list. Names, ranks, causes of death, all blending into an endless litany of sacrifices made to save the refugees. Liao brought me the latest report from the evacuation center. 6.5 billion people had already been evacuated, 1.5 billion remained, and 4 days left until the end of the operation. I did the math in my head. 59 ships, almost no ammunition, no repairs, no reserves, and the enemy still had a numerical advantage of nearly 40 to 1. I understood the fleet wouldn't survive to the 17th day. At best, we'd have a handful of ships barely holding together. But I also understood that each hour we bought with these insane tactics meant hundreds of thousands more lives saved, one more transport escaping to safety, one more victory in a war we had already lost by every military standard. Torres entered the bridge with another dose of stimulants and the news that 7 more captains had volunteered for suicide ramming attacks tomorrow, and I simply nodded, feeling something inside me finally break. Not the will to fight, but the last remnants of hope that any of us would survive this hell. I woke at dawn on the 14th day when the flagship shook violently through its entire hull, and when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the red glow of the emergency alarms flooding the bridge. The tactical officer was reporting in a breaking voice that the enemy had launched a massive offensive from all directions at once. They threw more than 1,500 ships into the attack. It was their all-in move, the final decisive blow meant to crush us completely and break through to the evacuation planet. I had 40 ships left, 40 damn ships against 1,500, and every one of those 40 was damaged, patched together, held up by the crew's faith and duct tape. I pushed myself out of the command chair, where I'd slept maybe 2 hours, and looked at the tactical screen, where the enemy's red markers were advancing from every side like a tidal wave of death. I understood right then that this was the end. There would be no miracle, no clever tactic to save us this time. 2 days remained until the evacuation was complete. The last 1.5 billion refugees were boarding transports in orbit around the third planet, and I made the decision I had known I would make from the very beginning. We would form the final defensive line right there, between the enemy and those defenseless people, and we would hold until the last transport jumped to hyperspace. I ordered all remaining ships to converge on the third planet and form a defensive sphere around the transport clusters. It was a textbook defensive position, the kind they teach in the first year of the academy. But now it meant only one thing. We had declared to the enemy that there was no more retreat, that this was where we would fight and die. The captains understood without explanation. I could see it in their faces on the comm screens. Each of them had already said their goodbyes to life and now thought only about how to make their deaths cost as much as possible. Admiral Chen, aboard the half-destroyed dreadnought Unbreakable, told me his ship would fall apart within hours anyway. The reactor was splitting, life support failing, and he requested permission to ram the enemy flagship once it drew close enough. I granted it, knowing I had just condemned 1,000 crew members, but also knowing their sacrifice might buy us precious hours. By noon on the 14th day, all 40 ships had taken up positions in orbit around the third planet. We hung in space as the last shield between civilization and annihilation, and I watched the approaching enemy armada with a strange sense of calm. There were no painful decisions left to make, no more choosing who to save and who to sacrifice. Only one thing remained: fight to the last breath. The battle began at the end of the 14th day, when the first enemy wave reached the outer perimeter of our defenses, and space exploded with fire so intense that the tactical displays couldn't keep up with all the simultaneous detonations. We fired everything we had left: torpedoes, rail slugs, plasma charges, even debris from our own ships turned into improvised projectiles. And every shot found a target simply because there were too many targets to miss. The enemy came at us in wave after wave, ignoring their losses, pushing forward with sheer numbers, knowing they would eventually crush us by mass alone. I watched our ships die one after another, the frigate Swift torn in half by a reactor hit, the cruiser unyielding, exploding in a cloud of plasma, the destroyer Spear Point simply disintegrating under overload. But each of our losses took dozens of enemy ships with it. On the second day of the battle, the 15th, Admiral Chen fulfilled his promise. I watched his dying dreadnought accelerate on its failing reactor and ram the enemy flagship. The two massive vessels collided in an impossible burst of energy that lit the entire system brighter than the local star for several seconds, and when the light faded, nothing remained of either ship but expanding clouds of debris and plasma. By the evening of the 16th day, I had only 11 ships left out of 40, including the battered flagship that was held together by little more than tape and wire. But we were still holding the line, still standing between the enemy and the transports. The enemy had lost more than 600 ships in those 2 days of nonstop fighting. Their dead vessels drifted around the planet in such density that navigation had become nearly impossible. The space around us was choked with wreckage, bodies, and frozen atmosphere venting from shattered hulls. Zhao reported that the final group of transports had begun loading the last refugees. They needed 8 more hours before they were ready to jump. And I understood we had to hold for one more night, just one last night in this hell. I looked at what remained of my fleet on the tactical screen. 11 mangled ships against nearly 900 still combat-ready enemy units. The math was merciless. But we had long since stopped believing in math. Torres brought another dose of stimulants and said the flagship's crew was ready to ram if necessary, and I nodded, knowing it almost certainly would be necessary, because tomorrow would be the final day, the final battle, the last chance to complete the mission for which we had paid with 190 ships and tens of thousands of lives. The 17th day began with the flagship shaking from a hit that punched straight through the hull and killed half the engineering deck. But I didn't even flinch. I just kept staring at the screen as the enemy's red markers closed in around us from every side. I had 3 ships left, the flagship Unshakable, held together by nothing but the crew's will to live, the cruiser Last Hope under Captain Zhao, and the half-ruined destroyer Avenger running on only half its engines. 3 ships against 800, holding orbit over the third planet, covering the last transports as they scrambled to finish loading refugees. Reports were coming in from every channel at once. The doctor yelling that the medbay was overflowing with wounded, Engineer Mackenzie shouting that the reactor was running at 200% and could blow at any second, the weapons officer reporting that torpedoes were gone and we had only 12 main cannon charges left. But I ignored the chaos. I watched the timer on my screen, the time until the last transport was ready to jump. 47 minutes. We had to hold for 47 more minutes, and the mission would be complete. 8 billion lives would be saved, and the 17 days of hell would finally mean something. The enemy knew this was the finale and threw absolutely everything they had left at us. Their ships advanced in a solid wall, ignoring formation, ignoring tactics, relying purely on overwhelming mass to crush our last 3 ships. We fired with everything we had, every shot precious, every hit needed to kill an enemy ship because we no longer had ammunition to spare. I saw Avenger take a critical hit to its engines and drift out of formation. Its captain shouted over open comms that he was going in for a ramming run, and before I could respond, his ship plowed into the densest cluster of enemy vessels at full speed. The reactor detonated, taking more than 20 enemy ships in a single fireball. 2 ships left. 23 minutes to jump. Zhao reported her fuel tank had been ruptured and her cruiser was losing maneuverability. She offered to stay as cover while the flagship retreated with the transports. I screamed into the mic that it was in order, prepare for simultaneous withdrawal, but she simply cut the channel and turned her dying cruiser directly toward the enemy. I watched on the screen as Last Hope held the enemy breakthrough alone, her guns firing non-stop, her hull peppered with new holes every second, until she finally exploded in a blinding flash, carrying the last echo of her name with her. Only the flagship remained, wounded, dying, but still afloat on the sheer will of its crew. And then I received the message I'd been waiting for 17 days. The final transport had finished loading and was ready to jump. The evacuation was complete. 8 billion lives saved. I felt something loosen inside me, like the vice that had crushed me all this time suddenly released. For a second, I just stood on the bridge, unable to believe we had actually done it, that we had completed the impossible mission. But the enemy was still here, their main forces converging on the planet, and I had maybe 5 minutes before we were crushed. I issued the final order of the operation: activate all remaining automated defense platforms in self-destruct mode with a 2-minute delay. It would trigger a chain reaction of explosions that would stall the enemy long enough for us to escape. Torres stood on the bridge covered in blood and soot, and when I said jump, he simply nodded and initiated the sequence that would carry us away from this nightmare. The flagship shuddered, space distorted around us, and the last thing I saw before the jump was the defense platforms detonating behind us, turning the entire Eagle Gate system into a gigantic minefield as enemy ships scattered chaotically, trying to avoid the blasts. We exited hyperspace 8 hours later at the outer edge of the safe zone, and the first thing I did was request a full transport report. Had they all made it? Were all the refugees alive? The answer arrived 10 minutes later. 8 billion people evacuated. Every transport safely arrived at its designated system. Operation successful. I sat in the command chair on the shattered remains of the flagship's bridge and felt tears run down my face. The first I had allowed myself in all 17 days of this hell. We had lost 197 ships out of 200. Tens of thousands had died in space protecting people they would never meet, and I stared at the list of names on the screen, promising myself I would never forget any of them. A month later, while I was undergoing rehabilitation in a military hospital, I received a message from humanity's new government. They had erected a monument in the square of the new capital. A massive monument of black stone engraved with the names of everyone who died in the Eagle Gate system. They called it the Monument of the 200, and every day thousands came to honor those who had given their lives for their salvation. I stood before that monument, reading the familiar names: Morrison, Chen, Zhao, Rodriguez, all of them here, immortalized in stone. And I finally allowed myself to believe that we had made the right choice, that those 17 days of horror had not been in vain, that 8 billion saved lives were worth everything we lost.